The year was 1887, and the high plains of the Colorado Territory were already showing their teeth. It was only October, a time when the aspens in the distant foothills should have been a gentle fire of yellow and gold. But a premature bitterness had already crept into the wind, carrying a scent not of autumn decay, but of the sterile, mineral cold of the deep winter to come. On a wind-swept parcel of land, distinguished by little more than a leaning, dilapidated shack and the endless sweep of frost-cured buffalo grass, two figures moved with a rhythm of relentless labor. They were sisters, Ilara and Maeve, and they were not mending the shack or preparing its flimsy walls for the onslaught of winter. They were digging a hole. It was a wide, deep, and unnervingly rectangular hole, far too large for a well, and too deliberately shaped for a mere root cellar. To any observer who might have crested the nearby rise, the sight would have been peculiar. Two young women, alone on the vast prairie, methodically carving out a space in the earth as if they intended to bury something immense. The truth, of course, was far stranger. They were burying themselves. Ilara, the elder by 5 years, drove her shovel into the dense, root-tangled soil with an economy of motion that belied the ache in her shoulders. Her face, framed by wisps of brown hair that had escaped her tight bun, was set in a mask of concentration. She was not merely digging, she was reading the earth. She noted the transition from the dark, friable topsoil to the paler, denser clay beneath, and then to the layer of gravelly sediment that spoke of an ancient creek bed. Each stratum had its own character, its own weight against her shovel. Her sister, Maeve, worked beside her, her movements less practiced but no less determined. Maeve was the muscle, fueled by a fierce loyalty to Ilara and a terror of the alternative, a winter in that slat-walled shack their father had left them, a structure that seemed to invite the wind in for a personal visit. They had been left with almost nothing after their father's passing that spring. This quarter section of unforgiving land, 2 worn-out shovels, a handful of tools, and a legacy of knowledge that their neighbors considered, at best, eccentric. It was this inheritance, the unseen and unvalued part, that Ilara now staked their entire survival upon. It was not long before their strange activity drew attention. Amos Kelleher, their nearest neighbor from 2 miles down the dusty track, rode over on his sway-backed mare, his wife Dora perched behind him. Amos was a man whose opinions were as solid and unyielding as the granite outcrops on his own land. He reined in his horse at the edge of the excavation, looking down at the sisters with a frown that carved deep lines into his weathered face. He took in the scale of their project, the growing mound of displaced earth, the precise 90-degree corners of the pit, the depth that already reached Ilara's shoulders. He was a man who understood the logic of barns and fences, of crop rotation and livestock management. This, however, fell outside any sensible category of frontier labor he had ever witnessed. It was work without an intelligible purpose, and that troubled him deeply. "Ilara," he began, his voice carrying the weight of unimpeachable common sense. "The ground is getting hard. A root cellar ought to have been dug in August. You're late for that, and this is far too grand for storing potatoes anyway." He dismounted, walking to the edge and peering in as if inspecting a grave. "What is the meaning of this folly? You should be chinking the walls of your father's house, not digging a pit." Dora remained on the horse, her expression a mixture of pity and alarm, as if watching 2 lost lambs wander willingly toward a cliff. She saw not industry, but the unraveling of grief, a madness brought on by loss and desperation. Her whispers to the other women at the Sunday gathering would be sorrowful, painting the sisters as girls whose minds had been broken by hardship, a tragedy to be lamented from a safe and sensible distance. Ilara paused, resting her hands on the handle of her shovel and looking up at Amos. Her gaze was steady, without defiance but also without any hint of apology. "It is not a cellar, Mr. Kelleher. It will be our home." The statement hung in the cold, thin air. Amos stared, his mind refusing to assemble the words into a coherent thought. He looked from Ilara's calm face to the dark, rectangular void in the ground, and then to the pathetic shack that stood silhouetted against the vast, empty sky. A home? In the ground? The idea was so fundamentally wrong, so contrary to the nature of man and beast, that he could only process it as a symptom of delusion. He was a practical man, and practical men knew that damp came up from the earth, that cold seeped into anything buried, that living in a hole was for badgers and coyotes, not for civilized people. "A home," he repeated, the word tasting like nonsense. "Child, you'll die in there. It will be a cold, damp tomb before the first real snow. The frost will heave the walls. The melt will flood you out in the spring. It will draw the damp into your very bones. You cannot live in the earth. You live on it." His voice was not cruel. It was the voice of certainty, of a man stating a fact as obvious as the rising of the sun. He was trying to save them from their own foolishness. "This is what comes of a girl trying to do a man's thinking. Your father filled your head with quarryman's fancies, not homesteader's sense." Dora Kelleher nodded faintly from her perch on the horse, her pity solidifying into a sad, knowing judgment. The poor things. They were digging their own graves and were too witless to even know it. Ilara did not argue. She had known this reaction was inevitable. Watching an outcome is not the same as understanding the principle. Her father had taught her that. He had been a stonemason, a man who understood pressure and strata and the deep, abiding truths of the world beneath their feet. He had spent his life in quarries and digging wells, and he spoke of the earth not as dirt, but as a substance with properties as reliable as iron or timber. He had never been much of a farmer, a fact that had earned him the gentle scorn of his neighbors. But he had understood the planet's immense, slow-breathing rhythms. Ilara remembered standing with him by a freshly dug well in the heat of a blistering August, the sun baking the prairie to a pale, cracked canvas. He had her lower a bucket, not for water, but just to feel the air it brought up. It was cool, almost cold, a breath from another season. "The earth has a long memory for temperature," he had told her, his voice dusty and quiet. "It doesn't care about one hot afternoon or one cold night. 10 feet down, the earth is the average of the whole year. It's never truly hot, and it's never truly frozen. It is constant. That is its nature. People build their flimsy wood houses up in the wind, where they bake in the summer and freeze in the winter. They fight the sky. They should be making peace with the ground." He had spoken of the great bison, who knew to shelter in hollows and against cut banks, using the land itself as a shield. He had explained the principle of thermal mass. A thick stone wall, once cooled, stays cool long after the sun has risen. Once warmed, it holds the heat long after the fire has died. The earth, he explained, was the thickest wall of all. It did not generate heat, it simply held it, and held back the cold with an unyielding patience that wood could never match. She had tried to explain a sliver of this to Amos, her voice even and methodical. "A root cellar stays cool in the summer, does it not? And the potatoes within it do not freeze in the winter, even when the air above is colder than iron. The principle is the same. The Earth insulates. Below the frost line, the temperature is stable. Amos had simply shaken his head, a dismissive gesture that ended the conversation before it had truly begun. A cellar is a cellar, Alara. It's for vegetables, which are already half dead. It is no place for a living, breathing soul. You are mistaking a root's needs for a woman's. He saw her knowledge as a dangerous misapplication of a simple agricultural fact, like trying to build a clock using the logic of a water trough. There was no room in his worldview for the principle to be scaled up, for the logic of the cellar to become the logic of the home. Amusement was a safer position than consideration, so he and his wife had soon departed, leaving the sisters alone once more with the wind and their monumental task. Their labor became a silent, rhythmic meditation. The hole deepened, first to 6 feet, then 7. They hit a layer of compacted shale that had to be broken with a pickaxe, the shock of each blow traveling up the handle into their arms and shoulders. They worked from sunrise until the light failed, their bodies aching with a fatigue so profound it felt as if it had settled into their bones. But with each shovelful of earth, Alara felt not despair, but a growing sense of purpose. She was not just digging a hole, she was crafting a sanctuary. She was shaping the earth to her will, using its own immutable properties as her primary building material. They began the careful work of shoring up the walls. They did not have the money for milled lumber, so they used scavenged timber from a collapsed prospector's cabin in a nearby ravine, dragging the heavy, weathered beams back to their site one by one. Alara chose each piece carefully, sighting down its length for cracks or rot, understanding that these timbers would bear the immense, silent pressure of the earth around them. They framed the interior walls, leaving a gap between the timber and the raw earth, a space Alara intended to pack with dry grasses and stones to create a capillary break, preventing the inevitable damp from wicking through. The floor was a bed of gravel, pounded down flat and hard, upon which they laid a floor of thick, rough-hewn planks they had managed to trade for with a traveling tinker in exchange for their mother's silver locket. The roof was the most critical part of the design. They laid heavy beams across the 18-foot span of their subterranean room, then covered them with a solid deck of the planking. On top of this, Alara laid a layer of oilcloth, meticulously overlapping the seams and sealing them with pine pitch she had harvested and rendered herself. Above the oilcloth went a thick layer of the clay they had excavated, pounded dense and smooth to shed water. And finally, on top of it all, they carefully replaced the topsoil and the sod, leaving only a gentle, almost imperceptible rise in the prairie, from which a single, stone-lined chimney pipe would protrude. The entrance was not a simple hole with a ladder. Alara had designed a sloped, stone-lined passage, like a gentle ramp leading down into the earth. It faced south, away from the prevailing northwesterly winds, and ended at a heavy, insulated door they had constructed from 2 layers of planking stuffed with wool from their father's old mattress. Every stone for the entryway was chosen with care, hauled from a creek bed a mile away. Alara fitted them together with a patient skill inherited from her father, using a mortar of clay and sand. It was slow, back-breaking work. Their hands became calloused and raw, their faces chapped by the relentless wind, their bodies lean and hard as hickory. Maeve, who had started the project with a desperate, fearful faith in her sister, began to see the logic unfold. She felt the stillness grow as the walls rose around them, felt the wind's power diminish as they worked deeper into the ground. The logic was no longer an abstract principle Alara spoke of. It was a physical reality they were inhabiting, moment by moment. By the first week of November, they were finished. They moved their few possessions from the shack into the single, large room below the ground. 2 simple cots, a small cast-iron stove, a table, 2 chairs, and a chest containing their mother's quilts and their father's tools. The interior was dark, lit only by the ambient light from the open doorway and a single, small window set deep into the southern-facing entrance wall. But it was not gloomy. The pale wood of the walls gave it a clean, simple feel, and the air was still and smelled of fresh-cut pine, clay, and wool. The day they moved in, a hard frost had silvered the entire prairie. Inside the shack, the water in the bucket beside the door had a skin of ice on it. Down in their new home, the air was cool, but it was a living cool, not the dead, penetrating cold of the shack. There was no draft. The silence was the most remarkable thing. The constant, wearying moan of the wind was gone, replaced by a profound and peaceful quiet. They had done it. Now, all that was left was to wait for the winter to pass its judgment. The test arrived sooner and with more ferocity than even the most pessimistic old-timers had predicted. A week before Thanksgiving, the sky turned a bruised, slate-gray color, and the wind, which had been a constant companion, fell utterly silent. A strange, expectant hush fell over the prairie. Ilara, stepping outside to fetch a log from their carefully stacked and covered woodpile by the entrance, felt the air. It was preternaturally still and had a crystalline sharpness that bit at the back of her throat. She looked to the northwest and saw it. A low, roiling wall of white that was devouring the horizon. It was not a cloud. It was the world itself being erased. "Maeve," she said, her voice calm but firm. "Bring in the extra water buckets. Now." They worked quickly, securing the outer storm door to the entryway and making sure the chimney flue was clear. Within minutes, the first snowflakes, tiny and hard as sand, began to skitter across the ground. Then the wind hit, a solid, physical blow that made the old shack groan in protest. The world outside their door dissolved into a maelstrom of screaming wind and blinding horizontal snow. They retreated down the sloping passage and pulled the heavy inner door shut. The latch clicked into place with a solid, reassuring thud. And then, there was silence. The deafening, elemental roar of the blizzard was reduced to a distant, muffled whisper. A rumor of a storm happening in another world, far above their heads. The air in their subterranean room remained perfectly still. The flame in their lantern did not even flicker. This was the crucible, the period of waiting where faith in the process was all they had. They could not see the accumulating snow, could not gauge the wind's true strength. They were sealed in their earthen vessel, adrift in a sea of white fury. For 3 days the storm raged. They fell into a quiet routine. They slept, ate sparingly of their stores, and talked in low voices, their conversation punctuated by the faint, ghostly howl that was the only evidence of the tempest above. Ilara tended the small stove with a watchmaker's precision. This was the core of her principle in action. In the shack, they would have needed a roaring, voracious fire, feeding it logs every hour just to keep the temperature above freezing, with all the heat immediately sucked away by the drafts and the thin, uninsulated walls. Here, the task was entirely different. She was not fighting the blizzard. The earth was doing that for her. Her only job was to gently warm the stable, still air that the earth protected. She kept a small, steady fire of well-cured cottonwood, using only a few logs every few hours. The stove provided a gentle, radiant warmth that raised the temperature in the room to something comfortable, even cozy. Maeve, initially anxious, found herself relaxing in the profound security of their shelter. She watched her sister, whose calm confidence seemed as deep and steady as the ground around them. Ilara's faith was not blind. It was observational, built on a foundation of understood forces. She trusted the earth because she had paid attention to its nature. On the morning of the fourth day, they awoke to a different quality of silence. The muffled howl from above had ceased. There was only a deep, unbroken quiet. Ilara rose from her cot and went to the door. She lifted the heavy bar and pushed. It moved only an inch before stopping with a soft, dense thud. Snow. She and Maeve put their shoulders to it together and pushed hard. The door swung open into a narrow channel, scraping against a solid wall of white. They had to dig their way out, shoveling the dry, powder-fine snow into the entrance passage behind them until they had carved a tunnel up to the surface. When Ilara's head finally emerged into the open air, the brilliance of the light on the unbroken snow was so intense it was painful. The world had been remade. Every contour of the landscape was gone, buried beneath a smooth, sculpted blanket of white that stretched to the horizon under a sky of impossible, aching blue. The air was so cold it felt like a physical substance in her lungs, a sharp, searing cold that crystallized the moisture in her breath instantly. This was the moment of sensory proof. They stood at the top of their snow tunnel, wrapped in their thickest wool shawls, and the sheer, brutal cold of the world was a shock to their systems. It was a cold that felt like it could crack bone. Then, they retreated back down the passage, through the heavy door, and into their home. The air inside was cool, yes, but it was a gentle, living coolness. It was still. It was dry. It felt safe. The contrast was staggering. Outside was a world actively hostile to life, a place of exquisite, deadly beauty. Inside was a haven of quiet stability. They had not merely survived the blizzard, which would have been a desperate, miserable ordeal in the shack. They had lived through it, in relative comfort and absolute safety. It was a victory not of brute force, but of intelligent design, of accommodation with nature rather than a futile battle against it. Ilara felt a wave of quiet, profound triumph wash over her. It was not a gloating feeling, not a desire to march over to Amos Kelleher's farm and point out his error. It was a deeper, more personal vindication. It was the feeling of a theorem being proven correct, of a complex equation resolving into a simple, elegant answer. Her father's words echoed in her memory, not as folklore, but as a statement of physical law. The earth has a long memory for temperature. Make peace with the ground. She had listened, she had understood, and she had trusted the principle. And the earth, in return, had held them safe in its embrace, just as he had promised it would. She looked at Maeve, whose face was alight with a mixture of relief and awe. And for the first time since their father's death, Ilara felt a sense of unassailable security. They had built this. With their own hands, they had turned a principle into a fortress. 2 days later, they saw a figure moving slowly across the snow-covered plains, a dark shape against the blinding white. It was Amos Kelleher, on foot, his progress labored as he post-holed through the deep drifts. He was heading for the spot where the shack stood, or rather, where it had stood. The blizzard had been too much for the old structure. The roof had collapsed under the weight of the snow, and one wall had been pushed in by the force of the wind, leaving a pathetic, skeletal ruin. Amos stopped and stared at the wreckage, his shoulders slumped. He had likely come to check on the sisters, expecting to find them frozen in the debris. When he saw no sign of them, his head turned, his eyes scanning the landscape. He saw the thin wisp of smoke rising from their chimney pipe, a faint gray smudge against the blue sky that seemed to be coming straight out of a snowdrift. Puzzled, he made his way toward it. He found the opening of their tunnel and looked down into the shadowy passage with disbelief. "Ilara?" he called out, his voice hoarse. "Are you in there?" Ilara appeared at the bottom of the ramp, her silhouette framed by the lantern light behind her. "We are, Mr. Kelleher. Are you well?" He descended the passage slowly, his eyes wide, taking in the solid stone walls, the heavy, well-fitted door. He was prepared for a damp, miserable hovel. When she invited him inside, he had to stoop to enter, and the change was immediate and shocking. He stepped out of the searing, lung-burning cold and into the calm, still air of their home. He felt the gentle warmth from the stove. He saw the dry wooden walls, the neatly swept floor, the two sisters looking at him with quiet composure. His own home, he admitted, had been a battleground for 3 days. Despite his best efforts, snow had blown in through every crack, a fine dust that covered everything. They had burned a quarter of their woodpile just to keep from freezing. Maeve handed him a tin cup of hot broth. He took it, his gloved hands fumbling slightly. He looked around the room, his practical farmer's mind assessing, calculating, and finally, comprehending. He saw the logic of it now, not as an abstract theory, but as an undeniable, sensible fact. The thick earthen roof, the insulated walls, the small, efficient stove, it was a system, elegant and effective. He took a sip of the broth, the warmth spreading through his chest. He had come expecting to perform a grim duty, to find 2 frozen girls who had died of their own foolishness. Instead, he had found the 2 warmest, safest people in the entire territory. He stood there for a long time, the cup in his hands, the silence stretching. Finally, he looked at Ilara, meeting her steady gaze, and he gave a slow, deliberate nod. "I'll be," he said, his voice low and raspy with cold and humility. "You did it. You girls actually did it." That simple admission was more satisfying to Ilara than any boast could ever have been. It was an acknowledgement not just of the outcome, but of the knowledge behind it. The news of their survival, and the manner of it, traveled through the scattered homesteads that winter, carried by Amos Kelleher himself. It became a story told around firesides, a piece of local legend. The Sister Diggers, they were called, at first with a tone of wonder, and then with one of respect. When spring finally came and the great melt began, their home did not flood as Amos had predicted. Ilara's careful construction, the gravel floor, the packed drainage layer, and the slight crowning of the earth above them, all worked in concert to keep the interior perfectly dry. That spring, several families came to visit. They were not there to pity or to mock, but to learn. They asked questions, and Ilara, patient and methodical as always, answered them. She did not hoard her knowledge. She explained the importance of digging below the frost line, of orienting the entrance for sun and against the wind, of creating a capillary break, of understanding the difference between insulating and heating. She shared her father's wisdom freely. The next few years saw a quiet revolution in the architecture of that high, wind-swept country. Families began building their homes partially submerged, with thick sod walls and earthen roofs, creating dugouts that were no longer seen as a mark of poverty or desperation, but as a sign of intelligent adaptation. They were warmer in the winter and cooler in the summer, and they withstood the punishing winds in a way no flimsy frame house ever could. The home that Alara and Maeve built stood for more than 70 years. Maeve eventually married and moved to a nearby town, but Alara remained, living in the quiet, earthen sanctuary she had wrested from the prairie. Children were born in that house, and they grew up knowing the story of how it came to be. It became a testament not just to survival, but to a different kind of wisdom, one that came not from conquering the land, but from listening to it and understanding the deep, constant, and life-giving truths that it held just beneath the surface.